Hey guys, I've got a game here to analyse. It's a 20-minute game played by two players in the 800 to 900 range, and this is going to be a quiet, gentle video because it's not even 6 o'clock in the morning here. I've got up early to do some work and just thought I'd do a quick video on this. Interesting game. It actually goes on for 70 moves, which is pretty long. But what we're going to focus on in this game is converting the win, particularly in the end game. So let's go through the opening, the middle game relatively quickly. So the guy who requested this is Mac5434 and he's rated 859. He's playing Tylor 7, who is rated 803. And white opens with e4, and we have e5, then knight to f3 and knight to f6. So we've got the Petrov on the board. Then knight to c3 and knight to c6. So we've got the four knights. Now the bishop comes out to b5. So this is the four knights Spanish variation. So this is basically the same as the Re Lopez, except that we have all four knights out on the board, and this c3 and f6 are out. Black now kicks the bishop, and white captures. So what he's done is he's removed the defender of the e5 pawn. Black now captures. Now typically I think you'll see, I haven't looked this up, but typically in the Spanish, in the Re Lopez, I think black would tend to capture with the d pawn, opening up a semi-open file for his queen in this situation. But I haven't analysed the game, so I don't know whether that's an inaccuracy or not, but something to bear in mind. Okay, and now white comes in, captures the pawn on e5 because it's now undefended. However, this does walk into, obviously the queen can come in. This is very common in the Petrov. So the queen comes to e7, kicking the knight moves away. We now have two attackers and only one defender against on e4. So I think black can capture here, but he doesn't capture. He pushes d5 instead. I don't think that there would have been any risk. Let's just go back one move. Let's say knight takes, and even if knight takes knight and queen takes knight, there's no rook or queen here that's going to cause any trouble. So if the queen did move down, you could simply exchange queens and force white's king to move. But with the queen on here, white's still two moves away from being able to skewer or pin the queen against the king. So I think it would have been safe to capture at that point. Anyway, d5 is played, d3, and we have takes, and then takes. And white doesn't recapture and exchange the knights off, which is absolutely fine. But black's concern at this point definitely needs to be the king and the queen on the same file. So we need to be thinking about moving at least one of those pieces in the next couple of moves. Pushes c5, and now the rook comes across. So the rook is now pinning the knight to the queen. There's no immediate threat of the f-pawn coming up to win the knight. So I think f5 would be a good idea at this point. But black plays bishop to b7, effectively losing the knight here. White does not capture the knight. Should have captured the knight because rook takes knight. It's defended by that knight. Actually no, that's the point of the bishop move. Now I see. Okay, well it's just another way to defend the knight. I get that. That's fair. At this point, I mean, you could still do. He's got. If you think about it, we've got 1, 2, 3 pieces attacking the knight and 1, 2 defending. So when you have more attackers than defenders, in this instance, it would still be fine. Knight could capture. If bishop captures, which it should not do, rook can capture and again win black's queen. But that doesn't happen. He brings the queen out instead, and this is a decent move. Rook to d8 to kick the queen, and now we have the exchange, but ignoring somehow the threat on the queen. So black ought to capture the queen, which he does. Well done. And now the knight moves away, captures on c5, threatening the queen, but more importantly, opening up the rook, hopefully to win the queen. There's no real way of blocking. I mean, you could put rook across, but then rook captures. You could put bishop to e4, but again rook captures. So I think at this point you should say that the queen is lost. This is a very decent move. Very decent move. Because this rook is now pinning the rook on e1 to the king. So this rook cannot move on the e-file. It's absolutely pinned. Very, very good move. Bishop comes out to attack the queen, and now we have a sharp position. So we could have lots of options for black here. Got rook, could take either rook. f6 is also an idea to block this bishop's attack. We'll see what black does. Takes the rook there. I think that was actually an error. I think because if you think about it, if rook takes rook, then you've got this rook takes, and we've renewed the pin. A better move may have been to take the rook on a1, and then if rook recaptures, there's no threat here because the rook's over here on a1, and then black could play that. But I think a better sequence would be, even if rook captured, I think you just want to take the queen at this point and kind of equalise on material, and then recapture the rook. Hang on, let's figure this out. Rook takes rook, white takes queen. It's not check, but now you've got rook takes rook again with check, forces knight to recapture, and then bishop takes bishop. So I think that then we've probably got knight takes bishop. So I can't figure that out, but I'd imagine it would come out kind of equal. Anyway, so we have rook takes, and now the king moves out the way. So the queen is lost at this point, but I guess you could call this an in-between move actually. So knight takes, I think that was the bishop, wasn't it? Yeah, knight takes the bishop with check, forcing the king to move. Queen's still pinned. The king's got to move. When you're in check by a knight, you've got to move. And so the king moves, and now the queen is taken, enabling the exchange here. So what we've got now, ooh, this is interesting. Okay, another kind of in-between move here. White ignores the possible exchange and throws in another check, but falls. That's actually a blunder. Okay, so now here this piece that was facing the exchange can now simply grab the knight, and now black is in a very good position. So this is where we start thinking about, okay, how are you going to convert the game? How are you going to win? One thing I would be thinking about at this point could be to get my rook onto, I think probably you want to get it here. This could be a goal. Because if you can get your rook to there, king's in check, has no escape squares, so that would force the knight to interpose, and then rook takes knight would be checkmate. So for me at this point, I would be thinking about playing f6 to free up this square, get the rook to there, get the king up here or here. You need to, basically the king needs to decide which side of the board it needs to be on. Now what we've got is we've got 3 pawns on this side against 3 pawns. On the queen side of the board you've got 3 pawns against 2. Now black does have a material advantage, so I guess another idea could be bring the bishop back, just to try and swap off these bishops, because any trades at this point will favour black as being the only player with a rook still on the board. Rooks are very powerful. This bishop is white's best piece at this point in time, so you probably want to trade that off. Anyway, so knight comes in with check, king moves in, this pawn is, he can't capture the pawn now, bishop comes back, and now the rook goes there. That's a very good move. Knight comes back, preventing basically checkmate in the end of the game. Attacking the bishop now. Bishop drops back to this nice position. This is always useful to have in an endgame. You know that that bishop and that pawn are protecting each other, so you can kind of forget about it. And if this pawn again moves to a5, then everything is secure on that side of the board. So you can concentrate on the important areas. Bishop attacks the rook, f6 breaks it, and bishop comes there. Now at this point I think I would definitely exchange bishops, and that's indeed what black does. Good move. Takes the bishop, and of course with f takes e3 now, that means that the king does have an escape square, so putting the rook on here is no longer game winning. So now let's take stock of the situation. Black has 10 minutes, nearly 11 minutes still on the clock, and white has 15 minutes on the clock. So at this point in time, the question that you need to be asking yourself is, okay, what do I need to do to ensure the win? Black is actually in an overwhelming position right now, having the rook, right? Rooks can land on any square on the board, as can knights, but knights are slow. Knights are restricted to these funny movements that they do, okay? Whereas this rook can control whole files and whole ranks as well. Now, one thing you need to be thinking about is what is white's best piece, and also what does white have to do in order to win. So one of the things that you'd be thinking about is, okay, I can only win if my opponent doesn't win. So one of the thoughts in your head needs to be, how can I prevent my opponent from winning? That leads to, how can my opponent win, and how can I stop it, right? Now, if white ends up with a king and a knight on the board, you cannot checkmate your opponent's king with only a king and a knight. Therefore, if white is going to win this game, one of these pawns is going to have to reach the other side of the board. Okay, so in order for black to stop white winning the game, black has to remove all of white's pawns. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. Now if you look at the relative strengths of the pieces, we've got a rook against the knight. That's a distinct advantage. Okay, but white's strongest piece is actually his king at this point in time. And black's king is also good. Black's king is in a slightly better position, being towards the centre of the board, so you want to centralise your king in an ending. The other key imbalance in this game is that having a rook means that you can corral your opponent's king into a corner of the board. Right? As long as your rook doesn't get captured, it can actually prevent the king from entering one side of the board completely, because it controls entire files or entire ranks. So one principle should be to get your rook into a position like that, for example, where it's controlling all of these squares, and this king might be stuck just patrolling this small area of the board. Okay, what that does, so let's say the rook comes to here and gets reinforced by a pawn, for example. Now that king cannot escape, it's penned in, and what that means is that white's best piece is quarantined in one corner of the board, and that leaves black's king then to roam the board and sweep up these pawns. Okay, so that's a principle that you should be thinking about at this point in the game. So the king now comes up the board. This is a decent idea, which I appreciate. Yeah, I mean, you could think about trying to attack this central pawn first of all, but then I guess king to f2 could defend that. Pawn is pushed, and the king comes into e4. Very good square for the king. Now the knight comes out, and this is a fork, right? So the knight is forking the king and the pawn. So the king has to move. Now what I would do at this point is definitely capture on e3, and then if the knight captures here, then you play rook to a8, attacking the knight, which would have to move. There's no pawn that can support it. attack the knight, knight has to move, and then you capture on A2. And then you sweep up these. So let's see what happens in the game. King captures, good. Knight captures, yes. And, okay, so it's attacking this pawn, but yeah, I guess C6 makes sense. It's defending the pawn, because if the rook had gone there, I guess knight simply captures. It's still winning for black. Okay, now the king is trying to wriggle out. So at this point, maybe something like G5, G4, H5, shutting off this escape, this bolt hole for the king, would be a decent idea. Always bear in mind that your own king has a kind of force field around it that your opponent's king cannot enter. So if you always think about this 3x3 square, and then where can you move your king to move that square in a way that pens in your opponent's king. Okay, so let's see what happens. Okay, now we have a fork. This is a rook fork. Hitting the king, so the king has to move. There's nothing that can get in the way, and also hitting the c2 pawn. So good move. King now comes to the corner of the board. At this point now, I think maybe king f3 would have been a good idea. It cuts off those squares, right? If you think about it, all of those squares are now would be my king's force field, and then with g5 to come, maybe then h5, g4 would actually be checkmate in 4 moves. So black now proceeds to grab the pawn, and now you always have to be careful when there's a knight on the board, or always have to be looking out for forks. Okay, and this is actually a fork. You've got the rook and the pawn on the same colour. They're 4 squares apart, and that is a classic pattern for a knight fork. Rook comes down, still defending the pawn and attacking the knight, so it's a decent move. Knight comes back here. So yeah, again, what I would be thinking about at this point is just pushing these pawns up and making sure this king has nowhere to go. Get the king over there. Makes total sense. This knight is not really a threat. Comes back again with an attack. Now the knight cannot come to b4 to get out of the attack and defend the pawn, because it would be captured there. So the knight goes to here. Do we grab the pawn? We do indeed grab the pawn. Okay, looking very good. All black really has to do now is to capture that pawn, and it will be more or less the end of the game. And now the knight can't go to there to defend it, and can't go to there to defend it. So what happens? The pawn moves up the board. Okay, so this is now a threat. You know, you cannot allow this pawn to get to the other side of the board, or white could win the game, which would be wrong, because white should not be able to win this game. Rook now comes across to attack the knight, which is a mistake, because this knight can't win the game for white. This pawn is white's best chance to win the game at this point. This knight's job is going to be to capture that pawn and to try and help this pawn in some way to promote on the other side of the board. And now another pawn is pushed forward, and good. I'm happy to see this. G5 is great. The reason why is because it covers this square from white's king. The other thing you could be thinking about now could be even, because kings can move in diagonals, so you could move your king to here, and then rook to there would be checkmate. There'd be nowhere for the king to go. Now, this is interesting. Because black has been reticent to pen in this king now decides to go on walkabout. And black starts to use his king to, in the campaign on the queen side of the board, to try and get rid of that pawn. However, I think it would have definitely been sensible maybe to get the rook to here at least, or even ideally to this square where it's protected by a pawn, and literally, you can imagine if the rook is here, the king cannot go anywhere. The king is stuck, has like 5 squares where it can move, right? So that should have been one of the first things that you just make sure happens, is pen in the opponent's king. It's his strongest piece. And now h4 is played, so we're in danger of, a king and 2 pawns against 3 pawns. It favours white on this side of the board. So one thing you could be thinking about is move the king, then get the rook down onto this rank, or even actually next move, rook here, would mean that the king is forced to go back onto the second rank, and then you can capture the pawn. That would be probably the way I would proceed at this point. But the rook now moves back across to b2. Remember, it went to kind of a2 before, and now it's come back over here. So slightly indecisive. Now I would push the rook to b3. Brilliant. Okay, there we go. Rook's on b3, so the king cannot stay on this rank at all, and it cannot go there because of our pawn. So the king is forced to retire. Now what happens? Pawn takes pawn. Good. And now you can see the king is now confined to these two ranks on the board because of the rook here. Right, this is the power of it. So now what I would be thinking about is bringing the king in. One good question when you get to this kind of stage in the game is to say, okay, how can I absolutely ensure a win? And sometimes that could involve, for example, a piece sacrifice. So you might even sacrifice a queen in return for removing your enemy's last bishop, for example. Okay, if in doing so it means that one of your pawns can definitely get to the other side of the board, that would be a very sensible trade. All right. So at this point, a strength of Black's here is that he's got these two pawns that could promote that are quite a distance apart, and a king on its own cannot defend against both of these because they're too far apart. Okay, you got like 3 pawns here. A king could potentially handle that advance on its own, right? But separate pawns not. So with that in mind, you want to be thinking about, okay, how can I ensure that I think this c6 pawn in particular is the key one. How can I ensure that this pawn remain protected? So let's see how Black proceeds. I think, okay, this is kind of understandable. The pawn is protected by the rook there, and it means it's only 2 jumps away. That's fine. You always need to make sure that this pawn is safe. What does White do? Brings the king back. Okay, now at this point, this king's doing nothing. It's just wandering around, you know, like a tiger going insane, just pacing up and down in its cage. So protecting this pawn, I think, is the priority at this time. That rook move is completely unnecessary. It's throwing in a check, but it allows the king to move, potentially threatening the rook. So let's see what the king does. Right, comes to h2. Now, Black now grabs a pawn, but gives up his own pawn, which he simply did not need to do at this point in time. This pawn is protected, so I would be thinking about coming in, maybe king into here, kick the knight away, grab that pawn, and think about promoting this one, right? Happy days. So, this is unnecessary. And we have an exchange of pawns. Okay, it does simplify the game in a way, I guess. So rook comes away, and now White's only got 1 pawn to think about. So a bit of simplification, not a bad thing. Attacks the rook. Rook moves with check. King comes along to attack the pawn. Knight can't go there. Can only probably go to a6. But instead, the king does a counterattack against the rook. Now, this is the point of the game where I would be thinking, okay, let's calculate. King takes pawn. Allow the king to take my rook. King takes knight. And what's the situation? Right, what's left on the board? You've got 2 kings, and Black has 3 pawns. And those 3 pawns are on the C and H files. Now, from there, Black's king could try and get to this square and start to shepherd this pawn up the board, right? Pretty much unstoppable in its own right, but aside from that, he's got an H pawn that can also do a dash up that side of the board. So I think sacrificing the rook here could be an extremely good move. unless the one thing I would need to check is if king takes pawn, is there a way for this knight to escape with checks, for example? I don't think there really is. So if king takes pawn, knight could go there with check, king comes to here, still attacking the knight. So I think that would be one strategy to go forward. So the rook moves out the way, knight comes here, and the pawn should fall at this point, but no, it's just another check for no particular reason. King moves, and now what is this king doing, having free reign, for the free run of the board? I don't think it's necessary. Okay, pawn comes in. One thing you could consider at this point now is rook to there. Pinning the knight against the king means the knight cannot legally move, and if the king starts to decide to come around, then you could even think about exchanging or simply move back. It's an idea. And in conjunction with that move could have been even more powerful. So rook to there, and then the king would have had to move, basically. King or knight would have moved out of there anyway. Okay, so knight comes down to attack h7, pawn comes up with check. Now this pawn is pretty much unstoppable at this point in time, certainly with a rook. So the rook can come to here, force the king off that file, and now the pawn should really just push up the board. Yeah, there we go. So the king's moving, pawn's moving, and now the knight comes in with a check. So the king has to move, and knight captures the pawn. All right. None of this would have been possible if that king wasn't in a commanding position right in the middle of the board. Okay, this is why we said first principle at the end of the game. What do I have to do to win and prevent my opponent from winning? Is just corral that king, just get it off to safety, where it can be controlled. But even so, now this rook is now controlling at least part of the f file, and white is going to have a lot of trouble preventing this pawn from converting. Okay, knight is coming in, so now you want to be thinking, okay, where can this knight go? And that looks like a key square here, right? So we've got that. It's covering the castling square. So now you've got to stop and think, right? What can happen? So if white just dillies around with a king here and allows that, allows that pawn to get to here, then there's a potential fork, and could, I don't know. It's a lost game. You just have. I think the thing at this point, what I would be thinking is, don't stalemate, don't stalemate, don't stalemate. I don't really think there's any way of this knight stopping the pawn from queening now. If the knight comes to here, you've got rook to f3 with a fork on the king and the rook. Knight does come to there. Maybe the wrong move, because that would have simply won the knight and the game. So it's again, it's kind of one of those little attacks where you're thinking, I think what black's thinking is here, oh, that's an attack, I'm going to make the knight move, rather than, and I think when you think that, you say, okay, that's an attack, it's going to make the knight move. Can I do better? What other options are there? Got 4 minutes still on the clock. This is okay. So anyway, the pawn's now going to promote, throws in a check, doesn't mean much, attacks the rook, doesn't mean much, counterattacks with check, so the king's got to move, and the pawn's going to queen. And now let's see the finish. Okay, that's actually a fork on the knight. Knight interposes. Okay, better move here. Rook to d2. Okay, wins the knight, because there's two attackers and the knight is pinned, so it can't move. The king would have to move away somewhere, and then queen takes knight and the game is won. But we have queen moves there, and that's not even a check, and you really have to be careful about stalemate dangers now. King back, rook back, king back to there. Okay, queen's coming in, that's a better check. And now again I would be playing rook to there, because the king can still move. It would have won the knight, and there we go. Rook goes there, king moves, queen captures, and a nice finish. Okay, so there you go, a little kind of lesson in endgame strategy. I think a lot of beginners actually find it really, really challenging to know how to convert one position like that. So I hope you've picked up a few little points from there. See you next time.